is rightfully terrified that I'm gonna break this cup. Today we're having a mystery tea, smells like green, from the depths of my tea drawer. But yeah, no idea what it is, where it came from, who bought it, probably me. But we have more interesting things to yap about today. If you're new here, my name is Steph. I usually read fantasy, sci-fi, horror, romance, but I also have a real love for nonfiction. So a month ago, I filmed my favorite fiction book recommendations, and it seemed like enough people would be interested in my favorite nonfiction books. So here we are, that's what we're doing today. Now, I really believe that you should be reading nonfiction that is interesting to you, not just to kind of make yourself seem smart or, you know, come across as intellectual, or there should never be any pressure to read nonfiction, because I think there's equal value to both kinds of books. But that does kind of mean that you're gonna get some real niche stuff from me today, and I feel like you're gonna kind of get to know me on a bit of a different level than you normally would when I'm yapping about this epic fantasy that I've just read, because the topics of these books are things that I spend a lot of time thinking about. When making this list, I found that my favorite nonfiction tends to combine two different topics or unexpected things or more that it seems like there shouldn't be a relationship between, and then explores that relationship. I'm going to use timestamps below that you can use to kind of navigate between the different sections or types of books very broadly. And yeah, it's gonna get niche, but I hope you hear about something that is interesting to you. I'm actually gonna hit it off with one of my favorite books of all time. That is The Face Maker. This is about the history of plastic surgery and how plastic surgery in the very early days developed during World War I to help people, mostly men, live fulfilling lives despite having significant injuries to their face and like facial disfigurement. That were often really severe, and how even like orthodontic surgery and all of that developed out of it. It's such a fascinating history to me, partly because I had a surgery on my jaw. It was an orthodontic surgery, but I learned that like that surgery, which was necessary for me, was a technique that was partly developed during World War I. There's a lot of pictures, there's a lot of, yeah, just really, really interesting history, because it's not just the history of surgery, it's also a history of the people who were living with these injuries after that war, and like the different kinds of ways that they tried to cope with it, including like making different kinds of masks and the challenges that came along with that. So I recommend this to anybody who's interested in the history of science, medicine, just niche, interesting history topics. I don't know, if it sounds remotely interesting to you, you should just try it, just pick it up. The next one I'm going to talk about is Underland. This is by Robert Macfarlane, I believe, and I've read it super recently, so I will be talking about it in my wrap-up as well. Robert Macfarlane is a nature writer, I believe he calls himself, who works at Cambridge, and this book just explores the idea of the underworld in myth and literature and history and like nature. It covers everything from like scientists with bunkers deep in the earth exploring dark matter and what that could mean for the world, all the way to mass graves and Viking burial chambers, and a lot of like Greek mythology, talking about the descent into the underworld and like how that would transform a character. It was so interesting and so well done. I really feel like in the hands of a lesser writer, all of these different topics would feel disparate and like just confusing and strange, but his writing style is just incredibly engaging and beautiful. It reads like one part travelogue memoir and one part history book. Yeah, Underland, just try it. I really was obsessed with this. Another history book that I want to yap about is called Raffles and the British Invasion of Java. So I picked this up because I live in Singapore, and Stamford Raffles is sort of lauded as a bit of a hero for starting Singapore, and you know, they kind of cite that as like the birth of the contemporary Singapore. I think that is quite disputed, and increasingly so in the last few years. But this is a really interesting book because it details a lesser known part of Raffles' story, where he goes to Java for a period of time. I think he basically drives out the Dutch and essentially massacres the Indonesian people and has a complete failure of a state. This is like, it's a full history book where it just details what happened and his sort of legacy and how that differs across Southeast Asia. And I thought it was fascinating. If you've been here for a while, you know that I love a book with references. I love footnotes. I like citations. I will go and look at that original source. Call it the researcher in me. I'm into this kind of stuff, and I just thought that this was a very interesting and really important topic. I did have a physical copy, but I gave it to my grandfather, and he's been enjoying it quite a bit. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about the Vori. So this is about the Russian mafia, and specifically how they developed out of the revolutions and the Gulag, and how they also sort of died out to an extent, or some of that culture became integrated into the contemporary Russian political situation. So this is just an interesting kind of look if you're into learning about gangster history, I guess, that explores like the meaning of the tattoos, how the Gulag and social norms within the Gulag kind of got brought outside of it, what the systemic situation was in Russia or the USSR. This is much more of a historical book rather than a focus on contemporary issues. So don't come to this necessarily if you're wanting to understand contemporary issues. But I thought that it was really interesting and a very easy read. The next super niche book that I will yap about, I recently finished. It's called The Serpent and the Goddess. And this is an older one from the 80s. So as I said in my wrap up a few months ago, when I finished it, I don't know how this would stand up to contemporary scholarship. But I kind of came to it for the purpose of developing my own creative ideas around a story. So that's why it's on this list, is that I enjoyed the way that she approached and explored some of these issues. I think that just reading the back is actually better than me rambling about what it's about. So exploring the exciting but largely neglected terrain of myth, history, literature, and theology, Mary Condren provides a startling account for the decline of the mattress-centered Irish society. Through the ages of Eve, Bridget, and Mary, she documents the development of patriarchal consciousness and analyzes its implications. I would say that there's huge emphasis on particularly the goddesses of old, like the Celtic goddesses. It definitely expands and talks about other goddesses and the interplay between all of that. It was interesting. It was an interesting feminist exploration. So there you go. Moving into this next one, I think you can really start to see that I'll have a moment of like intense niche interest in a historical period or society, and then I'll go and read like several books about it and be like, oh, that was very nice. I feel satisfied now. My curiosity is sated temporarily. But the next book is Children of Ash and Elm, A History of the Vikings. So I have read several history books about the Vikings, and this is by far the best, partly for its readability and partly because it was very well grounded in facts. The writer is an archaeologist, so a lot of the information that is coming from his and other archaeological research, as well as like textual analysis. It just kind of covers a broad span of different aspects of their life, their cosmology, their politics, the situation for women, and certain key moments, especially when it comes to making contact with like the Greeks or the Persians. So that's a Children of Ash and Elm. Anybody who's super into Vikings, I think, should give this book a try. The next one I want to mention are two that are very similar kind of books by the same author. Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs. This is by Caitlin Doughty. She is also a YouTuber and a mortician, and her sort of whole goal is about normalizing death, answering questions about death. Smoke Gets Into Your Eyes is one of the earlier books that she has actually written, and it's kind of an exploration around world cultural practices around death, but it's in quite short, brief essays that are a lot more focused than some of the other books around this topic that I have read. Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs is about questions that children have asked her about what happens after you die. And some of them are, really quite macabre and gross and gory. Other ones are just, will my cat eat my eyeballs? What am I going to decompose? Like, what is the situation with that? I like how she approaches it. It's with humor, but also respect. It isn't necessarily just for people who are morbid, although I obviously am. The next one I want to mention is the intersectional environmentalist. So this is sort of a primer or an introduction to the idea of intersectionalism, where basically the author is arguing that you cannot get rid of racism or climate change or colonialism or, many of the world's greatest issues, sexism, without addressing all of it, because they are all intersectional. And I think that the way she presented her argument was really well grounded. It was really approachable, and it didn't, to me, come across as like preachy, which I know can kind of turn some people off of reading a book, even if they agree with a lot of the arguments that are being made. And I think that she has a lot of other online resources, although I haven't seen them for quite a long time. So that's the intersectional environmentalist. The Age of Insight. This is by Eric Kandel, Nobel Prize winner, and it's a great example of what I was talking about when I say that I like books that bring together two different topics which may, in the beginning, not seem like they are related. But then through the exploration, you uncover a very rich history and a rich set of ideas. So this is leaning much more history-oriented than contemporary science-oriented. So this begins our sort of journey in Vienna in the 1900s, around the turn of the century, when Vienna was like one of the centers for culture and art and science and medicine in Europe. And so people were meeting in these cafes to exchange ideas across disciplines, and he essentially demonstrates how we can see that interplay between the art that was being made in the Viennese secession and other art movements around that time and coming up to present to when this was published, which was at least 10 years ago. And how Freud was there at the same time developing his ideas. Carl Jung was there. Lots of different key people in the history of medicine, science, and psychology. Really like a masterpiece book. I loved this because I am totally a fanatic about art that came out of the Viennese secession. That's like a whole other video. And I work in psychology. That is like my other obsession. So this is one of the best books for me. And finally, I am going to mention a magazine, which is called Selvage. I discovered this pretty recently, and I will yap a little bit later. I like to make my own clothes a lot of the time. I have my Instagram for that linked down below. Selvage has a different theme. It comes every 2 months, I believe. It's all about fabric and all about textiles from around the world. I have an online subscription, and I just thought that I should mention it here because there's always interviews or little historical articles that I just find really well researched, and the photography is beautiful. It's just such an immersive experience if you love fancy fabric and clothes and history and culture all mashed up together. Okay, I think we've done pretty good, team. That's section 1. We're gonna move into psychology and science. We had a few books in the last section that kind of bridged into that, but these ones are much more psychology and science oriented books. I have lost my copy for How Emotions Are Made by Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. When I say science or in psychology, I'm not really talking about self-help books. I'm talking about the science of it. Some of them will be a bit more sciencey than others. This one is pretty sciencey. But this is pretty much about this one woman's research that she has done over her life. She's very famous for it in the academic community. So this is about how emotions are made, or how our brain, which is this little lump of tissue in a dark cave in your skull, it interprets different kinds of information, whether it is sight, sense, touch, what you've heard, what you've been told, any of these kinds of things, and creates an emotion around that. So maybe I won't explain all of it. She has a fantastic TED Talk. Maybe I'll just link the TED Talk down below, and that kind of gives you a really good introduction to some of the ideas that she's presenting. But I think that it's really interesting and a very important perspective on emotion, especially when it comes to emotion regulation, things like anxiety. Why is our body producing these feelings? Asking questions like, why does our body produce anxiety or fear, even if the thing that has happened to trigger that should not be fear or anxiety inducing, if that makes sense. So I'm gonna kind of just leave it at that, because otherwise I'm gonna yap for 6 hours on this, but I find it really interesting, and I hope that if anybody picks it up that they will find it interesting too, and maybe even find it helpful, even if it's not necessarily this is how to heal your anxiety. I also want to mention The Body Keeps the Score. This is specifically about trauma and how the things that are traumatic don't just affect you in your mind, it affects you in your body as well. And your body kind of stores traumatic memory and experiences traumatic memory. So this is written by somebody who, especially in 2014 when this was published, was like one of the world's leading experts, and he explores different kinds of case studies to kind of unpack and discuss those issues. Some reviewers seem to feel that the experience of reading the book could potentially be a little bit re-traumatizing or not always handled in the best way. So if you're reading something like this, it's probably not a bad idea to be self-aware going into it. But generally, I found it was really well written. But I'm also not a very sensitive reader or person. But I also think that this is, for somebody who is maybe intimidated by a science book, much more approachable than maybe the first one that I mentioned. I will also mention to you Grit by Angela Duckworth. So this is also written by a researcher. And her research is and the book is centered around this question of why do some people succeed? And her conclusion is that, well, there's a lot of different kinds of factors that play into that. Grit, or this persistence, this dogged persistence, is a huge predictor of when people will go far and do well. So I think that I have this on my list. I read it several years ago now, partly because I found it really encouraging and felt that it helped me understand myself better in terms of areas that I have done well. I don't think that I have done well because I'm particularly smart, just because I'm pig-headed. And I felt like that supported my hypothesis about who I am as a person. But I think that it was, again, written in a really approachable way, really entertaining, with a lot of anecdotal or case study type of stories that help illustrate it, so it's not just really abstract ideas floating around up in the world. I will also mention The Grieving Brain. Several years ago, we lost somebody who was close to us, and my way of grieving is to get information about grieving and how that works in the brain. And so I saw the title of this and I thought, this is exactly what I need, and it was. So yeah, yet again, this is written by a professor who is sharing her primary area of research, and that's about grief. It's very approachable, it's very sensitively written. There is some humor in a way that is sensitive. And yeah, she just looks at grief with a neuroscientific lens and how that impacts our lives, including our social lives and yada yada. And I think that it is not necessarily a self-help book that I would recommend to somebody to read when you are grieving, but if you are interested in the process of grief, what the process of finding your way into the new normal kind of works for most people, then you might find this interesting. My other book is over there. I have to go get it. I think this is the easiest way to kind of give you an idea of what is all going on there. So we have the full body, looking inside the dissected body, procreation, upper body, lower body, etc. I won't show you anything too graphic, don't worry. So maybe we'll skip the dissected body, but I immediately know if somebody is gonna be, this might bother people. I immediately know if somebody's gonna be my kind of person. They walk into my house, see this book being displayed and morbidly fascinated and want to immediately start talking about it, or if they sort of move as far as they can on the other side of the room and are disturbed. Oh look, we can look at a phrenology head. That one feels nice and approachable. A lot of them are a little bit more gory. Some of them are a little bit less. Disquieting, compelling, beautiful, Anatomica. And the last one for this science-y section is Astrophysics for People in a Hurry. This guy also has a YouTube channel which you can just kind of hit up instead. My husband bought this because he's into astrophysics, I guess, and I read it as well because I just couldn't help myself. While I will say that I am not generally somebody who is that interested in astrophysics, this is good for people who are in a hurry. This is an explanation for people who don't feel super well equipped to approach some of these topics like myself. And yeah, I appreciated it. He just kind of covers, you know, hottest topics that come up regularly. What is dark matter, dark energy, the cosmos, invisible light, exoplanet Earth, all of that kind of stuff. Last section of the books that I've read, the memoirs, and then after that I'll just briefly go over some of my TBR briefly. So I don't read that many memoirs. I mean, I was homeschooled, maybe you can tell. I don't have a lot of the same pop culture references, I think, that some people do. So the memoirs that I read are often related to craft, my niche interests, politics stuff. That is why you probably won't see certain ones like I'm glad my mom died. I don't know who that woman is, I'm so sorry, but I'm sure her memoir is very nice. So at the top of my memoir list is Unraveling. This is about a woman who, during the pandemic, basically wants to understand how a sweater is knitted and make one herself, starting from shearing the sheep. Understanding how that process works and like carding the wool, dyeing the wool, learning how to knit and design her own sweater. And through that, she is talking about her own life, the experience of having a relative in the hospital during COVID-19, understanding herself as a woman in her, I want to say like mid to late 40s, and what that means for, you know, all different kinds of facets of her life. And I just found this so thoughtful and interesting and appreciated all of the different parts of it. So that is Unraveling. I'll also mention Dinner on Monster Island. This is specifically for people who might be interested in social dynamics, queer culture in Singapore. This is the memoir of a woman who now lives in Vancouver, BC. Singapore is a pretty conservative society when it comes to like gay rights and alternative lifestyles, and particularly when this woman was growing up here. So she reflects on some of the challenges that she encountered being queer. I think she says queer, fat, and brown. Yeah, what that was like for her, putting her squarely in a minority and a minority and a minority in the city-state. So I just thought that it was very thoughtful, it was interesting, and she does it through the lens of horror, particularly horror films, which I have told you in the beginning of this video, I read a lot of horror and I really enjoy it. And I thought her exploration of otherness helped me understand Singapore in a different way. And yeah, I thought it was very thoughtful and really well done. So Dinner on Monster Island. The next book, I wrote the hiking one, which I think is the one by Cheryl Strayed, which is called Wild. It's about this woman, she's in her 20s, she's trying to write a book, and she ends up writing a memoir about her kind of finding herself after she's experienced a great loss through the experience of solo hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. All of the anecdotes and the stories that kind of are discussed and pulled out through this memoir are like so funny and engaging and warm. Like Cheryl Strayed's voice really comes through, and I just had a really nice time reading it, and I think it's also one of those books that I read at the right time. But I will never not be able to think of Cheryl Strayed and not imagine Reese Witherspoon. The last one on my list is Wired for Love. Our memoirist is named Stephanie, and she's a neuroscientist who studies love and human connection, and she falls in love with a scientist who studies loneliness. It's such an interesting book to me because she explores love, but then because she's documenting her relationship with her husband, and her husband after he passes from cancer. So she spent her career writing about love, but also then experiences immense loneliness and how that changes and doesn't change her perspective on love. Like a lot of really beautiful reflections both on the science and the personal experience of both, and what that meant for her research and her husband's research and sort of his legacy going forward. So I thought this was just beautiful, like a really wonderful book about human connection and super approachable. Again, if you want something that's a little sciencey leaning but isn't necessarily going to leap straight into axons. Now we can yap about my TBR, which is possibly the most exciting part of this entire book video. I've been talking for way too long. The first one I'm going to yap about, though, is Prisoners of Geography. This is all about, you know what, I'm going to read the backs of these. I don't know what it's about, but we're going to find out together because it's been a long time. All leaders are constrained by geography. Their choices are limited by mountains, rivers, seas, and concrete. Yes, to follow world events, you need to understand people, ideas, and movements. But if you don't know geography, then you'll never have the full picture. So yeah, it's looking at how geography impact geopolitics. Very interesting. Being You, another neuroscience book. I think this will be a little bit more approachable. I've had it for way too long and intended to read it for way too long, but I'm already kind of familiar with this guy's work from my work. He's really looking at how our brains create the experience of consciousness. He has a great TED Talk. Maybe I'll link that down below too if I can. But this guy works at the University of Sussex, I believe, and he has spent his career looking at the experience of consciousness and the experience of reality and how that is created within your noggin. Okay? British Romanticism and the Science of the Mind. This was recommended to me by a colleague. It is all about, reading the back again. In this provocative and original study, Alan Richardson examines an entire range of intellectual, cultural, and ideological points of contact between British Romantic literary writing and the pioneering brain science of the time. Neglected issues like the corporeality of the mind, the role of non-linguistic communication, and the peculiarly romantic understanding of cultural universals are reopened in the discussion. Okay, and then we just keep yapping. But I know that the funnest fact in here is that Persuasion by Jane Austen is the first book that documents the experience and recovery of a traumatic brain injury. That is my fun fact that sold me on that book. I also want to read Braiding Sweetgrass. I believe the author of this is Indigenous and also a botanist. And so it seems to be about encouraging and exploring how our reciprocal relationship with the rest of the living world, including like nature, can be very, very healing for society. Correct me if I'm wrong, and if you can give me a better description, leave it in the comments. Good Morning Monster is another one that I am very keen on. I had a friend recommend to me, and this is from the perspective of a therapist who is sharing the recovery and the experience of some key clients that they have had for many years that had really severe challenges, and like what that journey looked like for their client and for them as a therapist as they were guiding them through the process of finding their way to like personal freedom and fulfillment. So that sounds really interesting to me. I want to read Rot, which is really interesting. I actually have this on audio and I think it's going to expire from the library. But it's called Rot, An Imperial History of the Irish Famine. A revelatory new history of the Irish Great Famine, showing how the British Empire caused Ireland's most famous or infamous disaster. Uncovering the disaster's roots in Britain's deep imperial faith in markets, commerce, and capitalism, Rot reshapes our understanding of the Great Famine and its tragic legacy. This was really recently published as well, from March 11th, 2025. And I really want to read something by Rebecca Solnit. I know that she is famous for a lot of her different, more feminist, I believe, writings, but there is one book that I am really particularly drawn to called Wanderlust, A History of Walking. So this volume provides a history of walking, exploring the relationship between thinking and between walking and culture. And she's just, arguing that we should keep walking and develop our lives so that we can keep walking, including our urban design, I believe. And so that sounds really interesting to me. I like to walk. That is a very key part of my mental health, my creative process. Every process for me kind of revolves around walking, so I think that I would just find that interesting and kind of affirming. Yeah, and then I want to read more from Robert Macfarlane. I've seen a couple of really interesting ones. One is called Landmarks. Samantha Shannon, who is a fantasy author prior to The Orange Tree, The Bone Season, one of my favorite series ever, mentioned it somewhat recently on her Instagram stories as being a book that changed how she thought about place names and naming things in her fantasy worlds, because it is looking at the etymology of how we have given these place names to different locations, particularly in the British Isles, what those meant, and just exploring some of that in depth. He has a wonderful looking book as well about rivers and mountains, and I just found that book to be so relaxing and engaging at the same time. And I feel like that's a hard balance for me to strike with nonfiction in particular. Something that I'm sucked into, but that I could also just like put down and go to sleep. You know what I mean? Yeah, because there's something very lulling and soothing and immersive in how he writes that is lovely and wonderful, and I want more of in my TBR. So, you know, we're gonna wrap up here. We're gonna stop. I have probably talked about 50 books at this point. My tongue is like gonna fall off. I don't know. I'm exhausted. You're exhausted. I didn't even remember to mention, I moved my computer and I see my sewing books. You know what, guys? These are good ones. If you want to sew, have at it. You made it to this point in the video. Thank you for watching. I hope that you heard about something that might be interesting to you and it wasn't just me like, I got into this little rabbit hole 5 years ago and I read this book and I still think about it. I hope you heard about it. Something that will also take you down a rabbit hole that is fun. See you again very soon. Again in another video sometime soon. Okay, the words are not wording. Bye.